Hey, you do it all the time. You make moral judgments, I make moral judgments. Well, what if moral judgments are a sham? That is, what if all moral judgments are false? That's the radical claim that J.L. Mackie makes. Today we're taking a look at Mackie's error theory that makes that claim, and we're looking at objections to his error theory so you can have your confidence restored in morality. That's coming right up. Now, what is error theory? More specifically, error theory endorses three main claims and then a fourth claim that falls out of the main three. So, as you can see on the screen here, we have the first claim that there are no moral features in this world. So we might look around the world and categorize certain things like that there are cups and mugs and certain things that have physical size or dimension, inhabit space, and so on. What Mackie says is when you categorize the world, nowhere do you find moral obligation, moral goodness. Nowhere do you find moral properties. They're just things that we think exist in the world, but they actually don't upon closer inspection. Number two, because our moral judgments are trying to latch onto or correspond to something in reality, and that's what would make them true, given that there's nothing there for them to latch onto, then our moral judgments are not actually true. Three, our sincere moral judgments, given 1 and 2, are sincere moral judgments when we say, it's just morally wrong for someone to commit genocide. When we actually say those things, our moral judgments try to latch on to something, but they actually fail to describe anything. Lastly, given 1 to 3, and given the fact that knowledge requires truth, it's sort of an epistemological claim. You can't know something unless it's true. I can't know that there's a cup here unless it's true that there's a cup here. If somebody magically removed my cup and I believed that the cup was still there, well then actually I just falsely believe that the cup is there. I don't actually know it. So if what you believe is not true, you can't know that thing. So because moral judgments are not true, there is no moral knowledge. You might think you know genocide is wrong, but you don't actually know it. And now let's go on to the second key. We can get more specific about what the error is in error theory. So the error in error theory, why we fall into error, is that we think there are categorical reasons which are in some sense objective. That is, such reasons would say we ought or ought not do things in a way that doesn't depend on whether or not it's in our best interest to act in accordance with those reasons. So for instance, imagine that someone wants to lie to enrich themselves. If there are categorical reasons, then those reasons can apply to them and say they ought not to lie to personally enrich themselves. And they apply to that person quite apart from their interests. Now, if there are no categorical reasons, then it will actually matter what the interest of the person is in acting and whether them acting will get them what they want. So these are hypothetical reasons. Hypothetical reasons are reasons that apply on the assumption that certain things hold. And as you can see, they're more relative to the subject because it matters what your interests are, whether or not those reasons bind you and say you ought not lie, for instance, to enrich yourself. Now, categorical reasons apply, as I said, regardless of whether acting on them gets us what we want. And because error theory denies the truth of all ethical claims, it's more like a metaphysical theory, a theory about what the world is truly like. Namely, that when we categorize the world, when we look out into the world and categorize things, we get objects, we get things that have size and mass and density and actually velocity and so on. But what we don't find in the world, we don't find moral properties, ultimately. We definitely don't find moral objects, and moral properties are something we sort of use. We say it's morally good, if you give to charity, and that's a thing we say and we use, but it actually doesn't have any bearing in reality. There's no actual moral goodness out in the world existing such that when we use those terms, our sentence actually latches on to something and has meaning. So the next thing is that there are 4 arguments for error theory, but there are problems with each of them. The first one is the argument from disagreement or relativity. Now, as you know, by just going onto Facebook for a small amount of time, there is a lot of disagreement about values. You'll hear people say, abortion is wrong. Then you'll hear someone say, abortion is morally permissible. It's the rights of the woman that ultimately takes precedence. Or you'll hear people say, no, that's actually a human life. It's just not fully developed and it has a right to life, and we can't just end its right and just willy-nilly. So, disagreement about moral codes seem to reflect people's adherence to and participation in different ways of life. So the conservative person, for instance, to speak sort of stereotypically about conservative values, will tend to think abortion is an important moral issue, and they'll think the right to life is what really matters. And you might say, well, that's because they sort of live according to conservative values. They probably have conservative friends. They think conservative thoughts. They have a way of life that sort of undergirds that moral code that they adhere to, and in particular moral judgments. Now, he thinks, this is Mackie, he thinks that the best explanation of this widespread disagreement in values is basically that there are no objective values for us to converge on. So when we look at the debate, especially between abortion, you can just see it's about split in the United States, 50-50. And you might say, well, this disagreement just shows there's no fact of the matter about whether abortion is morally permissible or morally wrong. That's what Mackie thinks all that moral disagreement shows. There really are no objective moral values. There's just subjective moral values that correspond to the way things people live and sort of the codes and norms and mores that they sort of adopt as particular moral agents. Here's a more detailed presentation of the argument from disagreement, or relativity of values, as it's sometimes called. Premise 1, if well-informed, open-minded, rational people persistently disagree about some claim, such as whether abortion is morally permissible or not, then that claim is not objectively true. It's just true relative to particular subjects. Premise 2 just says that this actually occurs. Well-informed, open-minded, rational people persistently disagree about all moral claims. Therefore, conclusion, no moral claim is objectively true. Now, there are a couple problems with this argument. Problem number 1 is premise 2 seems a little strong. And there is persistent disagreement about moral claims, but it's not clear that it's always between, quote, well-informed, open-minded, rational people. Instead, what you often see is that when disagreement persists, one party or the other is often acting in bad faith. That is, they're not being open-minded, they're not well-informed about the facts of the case, and they're not actually being rational. Sometimes they're just being emotional. That would cast doubt on premise 2 that all people with those sorts of qualities are the people who are persistently disagreeing about all moral claims. You might think, at least in theory, if people really had all those properties, that they could come to some sort of common ground or converge on the truth with regard to moral claims. Problem 2, premise 1 just seems false. There are lots of counterexamples. So you might say that slavery, for instance, is just morally wrong. And just because people disagreed about it back quite a while ago, And let's imagine they were well-informed, open-minded, and rational. It just basically they were morally ignorant. That didn't necessarily, just because that was the case, didn't necessarily cast doubt on the objectivity of the fact that slavery is immoral. It's wrong. Okay, and then premise 1 is also self-defeating. Premise 1 is trying to make a statement, a blanket statement about all disagreement. Namely, if people that are well-informed and so on disagree about some claim, then it's not objectively true. Now we want to know, is premise 1 objectively true? So for that to be true, then we're people to disagree about premise 1, which is very much what's going to be at stake. Like, we can disagree about it. We just presented a counterexample to premise 1. If we start disagreeing about it, then that means that it's not objectively true. If we persistently disagree about that claim itself, then it's not objectively true. And actually that undermines its intent to be an objective statement that applies to all claims about disagreement. So it undermines itself. Now let's take a look at the argument from atheism that J.L. Mackie gives in order to support his error theory, and we're going to look at problems with this argument. So the first premise, as you can see there, says that morality can be objective only if God exists. So God existing and being the author of morality is necessary for moral claims to hold and actually exist in reality, quite apart from human conventions, inventions, and use of language. Premise 2, God does not exist. This just simply asserts the atheist claim. Then 3, the conclusion is morality cannot be objective. But there is a problem, a tension with this argument between 1 and 2, because premise 1 rests on the assumption that laws require lawmakers for there to be moral codes, for instance, like the 10 Commandments, or the categorical imperative, or the principle of utility. For those things, those laws, to have authority such that they bind us and say we ought and ought not do things, and that really has some sort of weight and really holds morally, then there must be something that created those laws that gives those laws authority. There must be a lawmaker. Okay, but the lawmaker, again, can't just be us coming up with stuff, because the whole idea is that we're trying to figure out if morality can be objective. And the problem is premise 2 says there is no lawmaker. The lawmaker that could provide, according to premise 1, objectivity and authority to moral claims is a lawmaker like God, but premise 2 just says God does not exist. So there's a problem with that, and if atheism is true, basically premise 1 must be false. Next up is the argument from categorical reasons. So if there are objective moral duties such that you ought to do things or you ought not to do things, then there are categorical reasons to obey them. There are no categorical reasons, premise 2, therefore there are no objective moral duties. So the first response to this is to challenge premise 1. So it says, what if there are objective moral standards, but they don't provide us with categorical reasons? So you might try to disassociate objective moral standards from whether or not they actually give you reasons to do things that apply quite apart from whether you have interests or not. The second response is to challenge premise 2, which says there are no categorical reasons, and you might say, no, there really are categorical reasons. So the example given is seeing someone about to fall off a cliff. Now, let's say you're late for a meeting and your interests, and you don't want to get involved in trying to do any rescue because that could put you at liability. So let's say your interests point away from rescuing the person about to fall off the cliff, assuming that you could get there in time and save them. Well, a categorical reason would say you ought to go save the person from falling off the cliff, and that applies to you. That ought claim applies to you regardless of the fact that your interests are pointing in a different direction, and were you to go try to save them, you'd actually be putting your own interests at risk. Last but not least, we get the argument from queerness. And this is a claim about the weirdness of moral properties, were they to somehow be objective or exist. So objective values would have to be something unlike anything else in the world. You can't just see, when you round the corner and you see somebody torturing a puppy for fun, you don't perceive the actual moral wrongness. You see that the people, the kids, are harming the animal. You see the harm. Now, how do you link the moral wrongness with the fact that the boys are causing suffering to an animal? Well, you'd need some kind of faculty to perceive the wrongness and then link it, reliably infer from the suffering to the moral wrongness. But there just isn't that faculty. Now, if we are aware of objective values, it would have to be something like a special faculty, like I mentioned, like some sort of moral perception. You just sort of perceive, you just sort of perceive the wrongness, or some kind of intuitive faculty. And then he says, but why should we think any such faculties? We have such a faculty that puts us in touch with objective values. And then he says, lastly, because even if objective values existed, we might have no way of being aware of them. We might just as well conclude that they do not exist. So that summarizes Mackie's error theory, tells you what he is thinking, raises problems with it. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. So what do you think about the argument from disagreement? Do you think persistent disagreement among people who are well-versed actually shows that there are no facts of the matter that the people are disagreeing about, that they're just sort of each taking a stance that's just relative to whatever they already value? Also, what do you think about this claim that there are no objective moral properties actually existing that our language can latch onto in reality? It's just sort of like useful fictions. We go around telling ourselves certain things are wrong, helps us out, but if you categorize the world, you look at the catalog of the world's facts, you won't find moral goodness in there. You won't find moral rightness in there. Do you think that's right? Why or why not? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and as always, keep living the philosophical life, and I'll see you next time.